The word fired hit the room like glass breaking. The boardroom fell into a hush, sunlight slicing through the wall of glass behind the billionaire. His name was Ethan Caldwell, every inch of him ironed, measured, built for control. But control had just cracked. The translator stood frozen, papers trembling in his hand, until Ethan's voice sliced again. "Get out." The man stammered something in broken Japanese before fleeing. No one dared to move. Assistants stared at the floor. The foreign partners exchanged polite but uneasy glances. The air itself seemed to tighten around the long walnut table where millions of dollars were hanging by a thread. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Near the coffee cart stood Mia Carter, the event server who'd been pouring drinks since morning. She'd watched tempers rise the way some people watch storms roll in helpless, but unable to look away. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from recognition. She had heard every line of that negotiation. She understood the misunderstanding that just derailed it. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "This meeting is over." The lead investor from Tokyo leaned forward, confused, murmuring to his aide. They didn't seem offended, just lost in translation. Mia's hands tightened around the coffee pot until she heard the porcelain clink against the tray. That tiny sound broke her hesitation. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice was soft, but it carried. Every head turned. He didn't mean ownership. He meant licensing. Ethan's eyes lifted, slow and skeptical. "What did you just say?" Mia stepped closer, heat crawling up her neck, but her tone stayed even. In Japanese, the phrase for possession rights and usage rights is nearly the same. He mistranslated your clause. They think you're offering permanent transfer. A heartbeat of silence. Then one of the Japanese executives blinked in surprise and replied in his native tongue. Mia answered fluently, her posture calm, her eyes steady. Within seconds, the confusion cleared. The investor smiled. Ethan watched the exchange like a man watching gravity rewrite itself. His anger evaporated, replaced by something harder to define: respect, maybe disbelief. When she finished translating the last sentence, Mia turned back toward him. "They're ready to sign, Mr. Caldwell. They just needed clarification." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth tugging into a stunned half-smile. "Who are you?" "Just the waitress," she said quietly, setting down the coffee pot. Laughter rippled from the far end of the table, half relief, half awe. One of the partners extended his hand toward Mia, thanking her in Japanese. The deal was alive again. Ethan's gaze lingered on her as if trying to fit her into a world that had never made room for people like her. He looked at the stack of contracts, then back at the woman who had just saved them. "Remind me to never underestimate the waitstaff," he said finally, his tone low, almost humbled. Mia nodded once, her face calm, though her pulse thundered. The room around her erupted in renewed conversation, cameras clicking, voices rising. She stepped back toward the coffee station, invisible again, but not to him. For the first time that day, Ethan Caldwell looked less like a man of power and more like a man who'd just been taught the simplest rule of business. Sometimes the quietest person in the room speaks the language that saves everything. The meeting ended an hour later, but the tension that had filled the room still clung to the air like static. Mia gathered empty glasses, her pulse gradually slowing as reality caught up. What had she just done? She hadn't simply spoken up. She had corrected a billionaire in front of his entire board and a room full of investors. It wasn't bravery, she thought. It was instinct. She hated seeing things fall apart because of a misunderstanding, and she couldn't stop herself from fixing it. When she reached for a napkin near the end of the table, she realized Ethan Caldwell was still there. The others had filed out, their laughter echoing down the hall, but he stood by the window, jacket unbuttoned, looking out over Manhattan. The skyline was awash in gold and gray. He turned when he heard the faint clatter of dishes. "You speak Japanese," he said simply. Mia froze mid-motion. "I studied it. For a while." "How long is a while?" 4 years. Before life got complicated. He regarded her with that same analytical intensity he'd shown during the meeting. "You realize you just saved a contract worth 7 figures?" Mia set the tray down, unsure how to respond. "It wasn't about the money, sir. They misunderstood what you meant. Anyone would have said something." "No," he said, crossing his arms. "No one else in that room did." The statement wasn't accusing. It was thoughtful, almost grudgingly admiring. She glanced at him properly for the first time, dark hair slightly disheveled, a crease between his brows that hadn't been there earlier. He looked less like the headline mogul and more like a man processing a loss he didn't expect to avoid. "I appreciate what you did," he said quietly. "You handled it better than my own staff." Mia gave a small shrug. "I think they were just scared." He tilted his head. "And you weren't?" She smiled faintly. "Of course I was. But fear doesn't make truth disappear." That earned her a look of surprise, and something softer. He glanced toward the stack of documents on the table, the ink barely dry. "I owe you, Miss—" "Carter," she supplied quickly. "Mia Carter." "Well, Miss Carter, consider this my official apology for nearly shouting you out of the room, and my unofficial offer of gratitude." She shook her head, half laughing. "No apology needed. Just don't fire anyone else today." He laughed, the sound low and genuine. "I'll try to restrain myself." Then his phone buzzed and the mask of business slid back over him. "Excuse me." He turned toward the window again, his voice dropping into the precise, confident tone of a man running an empire. Mia slipped away while he spoke. The elevator ride down was slow, its mirrored walls reflecting her flushed cheeks and uncertain eyes. Beneath the adrenaline was a steady hum of disbelief. She had just spoken fluent Japanese in front of billionaires and not fainted. Her mother would have been proud, or horrified, possibly both. Outside, the city felt different, sharper, louder, alive. The early evening wind tugged at her apron as she stepped into the plaza. She checked her phone, 2 missed calls from her roommate, 1 from the hospital billing office. Reality never waited long to return. She drew in a breath and started walking toward the subway. Halfway down the block, a black SUV eased to a stop beside her. The tinted window slid down to reveal Ethan Caldwell behind the wheel, one hand on the steering wheel, the other holding a takeaway cup. "You forgot this," he said, holding out the coffee she'd left upstairs. Mia blinked. "You chased me for a paper cup?" He smiled faintly. It seemed unfair that someone who saved my deal should lose her caffeine. She hesitated before accepting it through the window. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." "Ethan," he corrected. "And I wasn't kidding. I could use someone like you. You read people, you listen. That's rarer than you think." She gripped the cup, unsure how to respond. "I already have a job." "You have potential, not a job," he said simply. "My office will call you tomorrow. Think about it." Before she could protest, the SUV pulled away, melting into traffic, leaving her standing on the curb with the cup still warm in her hands and a business card tucked beneath the lid. That night, she sat in her small apartment in Queens, staring at the card. Pierce Holdings International. Ethan Caldwell, CEO. It looked unreal against her worn wooden table, surrounded by second-hand books and a flickering candle she used to mask the smell of old paint. Her roommate, Clara, peeked over her shoulder. "Please tell me that's not another bill." Mia laughed. "No, just something strange." Clara squinted at the card, then at her. "You? And a CEO? Girl, this is either a dream or a scam." "I'm leaning toward dream," Mia said, smiling, but part of her chest tightened with something like fear, or maybe anticipation. The next morning, her phone rang before dawn. A crisp voice introduced herself as Ethan Caldwell's assistant. "Mr. Caldwell requested you join him for a meeting at noon. Casual attire is fine. We'll send a car." Mia nearly dropped her toast. "A meeting? With him?" "Yes, ma'am." He said to tell you it's about a translation opportunity." When the call ended, she sat there for a long moment, staring out the window at the rising Sunday. Somewhere between exhaustion and excitement, she realized this might be the first time in years she wasn't just surviving, she was being seen. At noon, she found herself once again stepping into the mirrored elevator of Caldwell Tower. This time, no apron, no tray. Just a simple blouse, neatly pressed, and a folder of notes she'd printed overnight. She didn't know what to expect, an interview maybe, or a polite thank you lunch before he forgot her name. The doors opened to the top floor. The same skyline stretched before her, but the energy was different. It felt like possibility. Ethan stood by the conference table, not in a suit, but in a gray shirt rolled at the sleeves. "You came," he said, as if he hadn't been certain she would. "I figured I should return the coffee," she replied. He chuckled. "You might have to earn it this time." He gestured to a stack of documents. "We have another client arriving soon. Their translator canceled last minute. You up for another rescue?" Mia hesitated only a second, then nodded. "Just tell me what language we're saving today." "French," he said, "and about $200 million. Endera." The city outside shimmered in the afternoon light, a silent witness as a waitress with nothing to lose prepared to rewrite her own story. The second meeting began with the heavy quiet that only serious money could summon. The boardroom lights were dimmed, the glass walls reflecting the skyline like a mirror of power. Mia stood at the side, palms damp but spine straight. She'd spent most of the morning rehearsing French technical phrases, terrified of stumbling over a word in front of Ethan Caldwell. The door opened with a hush. Two men in dark suits entered, followed by a woman with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from owning half of Europe. The head of Valmont Aerotech, one of France's top engineering firms. The woman greeted Ethan in flawless English, but her partners slipped into rapid French among themselves, scanning the contracts. Ethan's translator had bailed that morning, nerves apparently, and now the fate of another multi-million-dollar deal rested in the hands of a woman who, 48 hours earlier, had been refilling coffee cups. Ethan gestured for her to sit beside him. "Miss Carter will assist with language today," he said casually. The Valmont executive raised an eyebrow. "Your assistant?" Mia smiled politely. "Temporary interpreter, madame." Her French was fluid, formal, and precise. The woman's surprise flickered only for a second before giving a curt nod. For the next 30 minutes, Mia translated technical jargon, legal subclauses, and small talk about manufacturing schedules. She listened harder than she had ever listened in her life. Every syllable, every pause, every glance exchanged across the table. Ethan barely spoke. He let her work, his hand resting on the table near hers, his attention fixed on the flow of conversation like a man studying an unexpected miracle. When the French team began to debate quietly, Mia caught the tone shift. Their lead engineer muttered something about liability transfers, a subtle warning that the deal, as written, placed all financial risk on their side. Mia's stomach tightened. She looked at Ethan. "They're hesitating," she whispered. "They believe your clause gives you the right to pull funding without covering damages." His brow furrowed. "That's not what I meant." "I know, but that's how it reads." She took a deep breath and turned to the French team. "Monsieur Valmont, peut-être qu'une clause d'équilibre conviendrait mieux?" she suggested softly. Maybe a balancing clause would be more appropriate. The woman looked surprised, then intrigued. "Vous proposez un partage des risques?" "Exactement," Mia said. "A shared responsibility clause. Equal risk, equal reward." A ripple of interest moved through the French delegation. Ethan leaned forward, watching as she smoothed over tension he hadn't even known existed. Within minutes, the tone of the room shifted from guarded to collaborative. The engineer nodded. The lawyers began redlining new phrasing. By the time the last paragraph was reviewed, the atmosphere had thawed completely. When Valmont signed the final document, Ethan exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. Cameras flashed. The French team offered handshakes and even a champagne toast. Mia translated each word with effortless grace. When they left, the room fell silent again, this time from relief. Ethan turned to her slowly, as if trying to process what had just happened. "You just negotiated my deal," he said finally. "You negotiated it," Mia replied. "I just helped everyone hear the same language." "That's the same thing," he said, smiling for real this time. She felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly busied herself gathering the empty glasses. "You didn't need me," she said quietly. Ethan leaned against the table, watching her. "You're wrong about that. I needed someone who could tell the truth without worrying who's listening. Do you know how rare that is in my world?" She looked up, meeting his eyes. They weren't cold steel now, they were human, almost weary. "You built this world," she said. "Yes," he admitted. "And maybe it's time to fix the parts I broke." He reached into his jacket and handed her a slim folder. "This is an offer letter. Interpreter position. Full-time, you'll have to put up with me more than you'd like." Mia stared at the document, unable to speak. "Mr. Caldwell, Ethan," he corrected again. "And think before you say no." She hesitated. "Why me? You could hire anyone." "I could," he said. "But anyone else would tell me what I want to hear. You don't do that." For a moment, the air between them felt charged. Not romantic, not yet, but something deeper. Recognition. Two people from opposite ends of the social map who somehow understood the same language. Decency. Mia took a slow breath. "I'll think about it." "Good," he said, though there was a flicker of disappointment he didn't hide well. "I'll have my assistant send the paperwork." She nodded, clutching the folder. "I should go before I start believing this is normal." He chuckled. "Normal is overrated." That night, she walked along the East River, the city lights rippling across the dark water. The wind was cool, her mind too full to rest. She thought of her mother's hospital bills, of the years she'd spent serving people who never looked her in the eye. She thought of Ethan's face when he said, "You don't do that." For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. 2 days later, she walked into Pierce Holdings wearing a tailored blazer borrowed from Clara. The receptionist looked up. "Miss Carter? Mr. Caldwell is expecting you." "Oh." In the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored doors. Same eyes, same hands, but steadier. She wasn't sure where this path led, but she knew one thing: she would never again stand silent while truth was lost in translation. When the doors opened, Ethan was waiting near the window, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Welcome back," he said, offering one. "Do I still count as just the waitress?" she teased. He smiled. "You never did." And as the city stretched out beneath them, 2 very different lives began to share the same story, one built not on power or status, but on the simple courage to speak when no one else would. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of Mia's new life settled into something both exhilarating and unreal. Each morning, she stepped into the mirrored lobby of Pierce Holdings, not as the woman with a tray, but as the interpreter. Her badge gleamed beneath her name. Her heels clicked across the marble floors, and her voice carried authority that startled even herself. Still, every time the elevator doors closed, she whispered a small reminder, "Don't forget where you came from." Her first weeks were a blur of meetings, coffee-fueled negotiations, and translation calls that stretched across time zones. Ethan Caldwell was relentless, moving through business like a storm, fast, precise, but never cruel since that day. He spoke less sharply now, but his presence still filled every room like electricity. And somehow, between presentations and late-night strategy sessions, an unspoken connection began to hum quietly beneath the surface. One night, as the rest of the staff filtered out, Ethan called across the empty office. "Mia, got a second?" She turned from her desk, pushing back her chair. "Of course, sir." He gave her that half-smile that always made her self-conscious. "Ethan," he corrected, just as he always did. He gestured to the skyline glowing beyond the glass wall. "You ever notice how this city never really sleeps? Even when the lights go out, something's always humming beneath it." Mia crossed her arms, curious. "Is that your way of saying we should all work harder?" He laughed softly. "No. My way of saying I don't know how to stop." She studied him for a moment. In the dim light, without the armor of his tailored suits, he looked human, tired, maybe even lonely. "Maybe you're afraid that if you stop, everything you built disappears." He leaned against the window, his reflection merging with the cityscape. "You might be right about that." Then, quieter, "You ever wonder what it's like to start from nothing again?" Her heart flickered. "Every day," she said, "but I don't see it as starting from nothing, just starting from truth." He smiled, faint but real. "That's what I like about you, Mia. You make everything sound simple when it isn't." The moment hung there, fragile and charged, until her phone buzzed. It was the hospital again. Her mother's condition had worsened. The color drained from her face. Ethan noticed instantly. "Everything all right?" She shook her head. "My mother's in recovery, but they're talking about another surgery." "Go," he said without hesitation. "Take my car. I'll have someone drive you." Mia blinked. "I can take the subway. It's fine." "It's not fine," he said, his tone firm but kind. "Family comes first. Always." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her. She nodded, whispering a thank you before hurrying out. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and night. Her mother lay pale but smiling, fingers brushing Mia's wrist when she arrived. "You look different," Laura said softly. "You look alive." Mia laughed, tears pricking her eyes. "Maybe I just finally found where I'm supposed to be." They talked until her mother drifted off to sleep. Outside the room, Mia checked her phone again. One message from Ethan. "Take the week if you need it. The deal can wait." She stared at the text, a lump forming in her throat. He didn't owe her compassion, but he offered it anyway. That night, she realized something about him had shifted, not just in the way he treated her, but in the way he treated everyone. By the time she returned to work, the atmosphere in the office had changed. The usual stiffness had softened. Assistants smiled more. Meetings ended with laughter instead of exhaustion. Ethan still demanded excellence, but now he listened, really listened. Then came the board meeting that would test them both. A rival executive named Robert Vale, sharp as glass and twice as dangerous, had been questioning Ethan's leadership for weeks. He'd called an emergency review to challenge a recent partnership, one that Mia had translated. As they entered the sleek conference hall, whispers followed. Robert's smirk was the kind that fed off other people's fear. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness, "I heard your new interpreter is handling international contracts now." Quite the promotion from pouring coffee. The room shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's expression stayed calm, but Mia could feel the tension coiled beneath his surface. She took a slow breath and stepped forward. "That's correct, Mr. Vale, and I believe the Tokyo and Valmont contracts speak for themselves, both executed flawlessly." Robert chuckled, glancing around the table. "We'll see how long flawless lasts when the real pressure hits." Ethan finally spoke, voice low and controlled. "Careful, Robert. The last person who underestimated her ended up signing a deal they'd been chasing for 5 years." The silence that followed was delicious. Robert's smirk faltered, and for the first time, the board looked impressed not just with Ethan, but with the young woman standing beside him. After the meeting, Ethan found her in the hallway. "You handled that beautifully," he said. She smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I've had practice being underestimated." "Oh, then maybe it's time they stopped." He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Mia, I meant what I said before. You've changed this place. You've changed me." Her breath caught. She wanted to reply, but her throat tightened. All she managed was, "Then I guess we're both learning a new language." For a long moment, neither moved. The city hummed beyond the glass walls, the same endless sound, but softer somehow, as if even New York had paused to listen. Later that night, as she left the office, the reflection of her own face in the elevator door startled her. She barely recognized the woman, looking back stronger, steadier, no longer invisible. The world she had once served from the shadows now looked her straight in the eye. And somewhere in the spaces between ambition and compassion, between fear and faith, Mia Carter realized she was no longer just the waitress who spoke up in a room full of silence. She was the voice that changed it. The following month brought a kind of calm before a storm, subtle, deceptive, the way New York quiets before the first roll of summer thunder. Mia had grown into her new role with grace, earning respect even from those who had doubted her at first. She was no longer the waitress who translated once. She was Mia Carter, the interpreter who could turn chaos into understanding. But something in Ethan had shifted again. He was sharper, more distant. The warmth that had flickered between them during late-night meetings was replaced by the cool precision of a man cornered by unseen pressure. Mia noticed the signs, the unanswered calls, the clipped tone, the tension in his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. One evening, after a long day of negotiations, she caught him staring at the skyline, jaw tight. "You're not sleeping," she said quietly. He didn't turn around. "Who has time for sleep when the sharks smell blood?" She frowned. "Robert Vale again?" Ethan's chuckle was dry. "Robert and his friends. They're building a case, claiming I manipulated data on the Valmont deal. They want a vote to remove me as CEO." Mia's heart dropped. "That's ridiculous. Everything was transparent. I translated every document myself." "They're saying the translation was biased in my favor," he said bitterly. "Apparently competence is now a crime." Her throat tightened. "Then let me speak. I can defend the integrity of those meetings." He cut her off, shaking his head. "You can't. They'll tear you apart. They'll say I coached you. They'll turn your words into mine." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the city below. Then he sighed, weary. "Don't get pulled into this, Mia. I can handle it." But she could see the cracks in his armor, the fatigue, the fear he refused to name. And she knew, deep down, that the fight was already spiraling beyond his control. The next morning, the headlines broke. Pierce Holdings under review for ethics breach. CEO Ethan Caldwell accused of contract manipulation. Stock prices plummeted before noon. Cameras crowded the building's entrance. By afternoon, the board had called an emergency hearing. Ethan faced them in silence as accusations filled the room. Robert Vale led the attack with theatrical precision, waving papers and citing confidential sources. He painted a picture of greed, deceit, and corporate arrogance, and every word stabbed deeper into the image Ethan had spent years building. Mia sat outside the glass walls of the conference room, her hands gripping her notepad until her knuckles turned white. Through the glass, she could see him composed, calm, but bleeding behind the eyes. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. She pushed the door open. The room went still. "Miss Carter," Robert said with a thin smile, "you're not part of this session. I am now." Her voice was steady, though her pulse roared in her ears. "Because if you're going to use my name to destroy someone, you'll have to listen to me first." Ethan's eyes widened. A silent plea, "Don't." But she stepped forward anyway. "You want the truth about those negotiations? Fine. I translated every line, every clause, every word. And if you're suggesting I falsified anything, then you're accusing me, not him." Robert's smirk faltered. "No one's accusing you, Miss Carter. We're questioning influence." "Influence?" she repeated. "You mean ethics? Because I remember you sending your assistant to bribe Valmont's legal team before that meeting. They declined, if I recall." A ripple moved through the boardroom. Robert's face darkened. "You're out of line." "So were you," Mia said quietly. "And you're about to regret it." From her folder, she pulled out a printed email chain, something she'd archived weeks earlier just in case. It was a trail of correspondence between Robert and Valmont's counsel, filled with veiled promises and mutual benefits. Ethan looked stunned. "This," Mia continued, laying the papers flat, "is what manipulation looks like. Not a mistranslated phrase, not a fair negotiation, but corruption disguised as courtesy." The room buzzed with whispers. The head of the ethics committee leaned forward, scanning the documents. "Where did you get this?" "I was copied on one of the replies by mistake," Mia said. "Guess Robert forgot to check who was in the CC line." Robert's voice cracked. "This doesn't prove—" "It proves intent," she interrupted, And if you want to talk about influence, maybe ask yourself why your assistant called Valmont's CFO 5 times the night before their contract renewal. Silence. The kind that stripped oxygen from the air. Ethan exhaled, slowly, his gaze locked on her, a mix of awe and disbelief. The chairwoman finally spoke. "Mr. Vale, until this is verified, all proceedings against Mr. Caldwell are suspended." Robert's expression collapsed, fury barely contained. "You think you've won?" he hissed at Ethan as he stormed out. Mia turned toward the door but felt a hand on her arm. Ethan's voice was low. "You just risked your career." She met his gaze. "So did you, when you hired me." The boardroom emptied around them, but neither moved. The sun dipped lower, painting the city in amber light. For the first time in days, Ethan's shoulders eased. He looked at her like she was something solid in a world that had just crumbled beneath his feet. "You saved me again," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "You saved yourself the day you started listening." He smiled, tired but grateful. "Mia Carter, if I ever forget that, remind me." I will," she said, her voice softer now. "But you won't forget." Outside the conference room, the office hummed with cautious optimism. The whispers had shifted from scandal to respect, from downfall to survival. That evening, as they rode the elevator down, neither spoke. The quiet wasn't heavy, it was peaceful. When the doors opened, Ethan turned to her. "Dinner?" She blinked. As in thank you. No contracts, no negotiations, just dinner." And for the first time in weeks, Mia laughed. "I'll think about it." The elevator doors closed again, reflecting their faint smiles. Somewhere between scandal and salvation, the balance of power had changed once more, not through force or wealth, but through truth. And as the lights of Manhattan flickered against the glass, Ethan Caldwell realized something money had never taught him. Power survives on silence, but redemption begins when someone finally decides to speak. The dinner that followed was nothing like the sharp-edged meetings or tense negotiations that had defined their lives for months. Ethan chose a quiet place, a restaurant tucked between brownstones on the Upper East Side, where the lighting was warm and soft, and the sound of clinking glasses felt almost like background music to a calmer world. When Mia arrived, he was already there, standing as she approached, a gesture that seemed old-fashioned for a man who commanded billions. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, pulling out her chair. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, smiling slightly. "But I figured if you can survive a boardroom mutiny, dinner should be harmless." Ethan laughed, the sound low and genuine. "I promise no spreadsheets tonight." As they settled in, the conversation came easier than either expected. They talked about small things first, the absurdity of Manhattan traffic, the best bagels in Queens, the way people used to write letters instead of emails. But gradually, the surface chatter gave way to something real. Ethan's expression softened when she mentioned her mother. "How's she doing?" "Better," Mia said, stirring her drink. "The new treatment's working. She keeps asking when I'm going to take a day off." "You should," he said, meaning it. "You've earned more than a few." She met his gaze across the candlelight. "You know, most people in your position would have fired me for speaking up the way I did in that boardroom." He smiled faintly. "Most people in my position deserve to be spoken to that way." Silence lingered between them, not awkward but thoughtful. Outside, the city pulsed with distant sirens and laughter. Inside, it was quiet enough to hear the faint rhythm of the piano. Mia leaned back. "So what happens now, Ethan? You survived the scandal, the company's safe. Are you going back to the way things were?" He shook his head. "No, the way things were nearly destroyed me. I used to think control meant security, that if I managed every detail, no one could hurt me." He paused. "But control isn't the same as peace." Mia smiled gently. "Peace isn't built on fear. It's built on trust." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the air seemed to still. Ethan looked at her, as though he were seeing something or someone he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. "Do you trust me?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, not from doubt, but from honesty. "I'm learning to," he nodded, accepting that as truth. "Then that's enough." The rest of the evening unfolded like the slow unwinding of a storm. They spoke about the past, about the dreams they'd lost, the things they'd given up. Mia confessed how she'd once been offered a scholarship to study linguistics in Paris, but turned it down to care for her mother. Ethan shared how he'd built his first company out of desperation, not passion, after losing his father's inheritance in a bad investment. "I thought if I made enough money I could buy back my mistakes," he said. "Turns out money just rents forgiveness. It never owns it." Mia studied him for a long moment. "You can't buy forgiveness, Ethan. You can only live in a way that earns it." He smiled, almost rueful. "You always find a way to sound like you're teaching me something." "Maybe you just like learning the hard way," she teased. By the time dessert arrived, something between them had changed. Not a confession, not yet, but an understanding. Two people who had built their lives from different kinds of struggle, finally meeting on common ground. As they stepped outside, the city was washed in rainlight. The pavement glimmered like glass, and the air smelled of thunder and promise. Ethan held an umbrella over them, his shoulder brushing hers as they walked. "I've been thinking about something," he said quietly. "The company's restructuring. We're building a new division for international communications. I want you to run it." Mia stopped mid-step. "You're joking." "I'm not." He looked at her, serious now. "You've proven you're more than an interpreter. You see things people miss. You bridge worlds. That's what leaders do." Her heart stuttered. "Ethan, I don't know if I'm ready for that." "You were ready the moment you spoke up in that meeting. You just didn't know it yet." She looked down, the rain catching in her lashes. "And what if I fail?" He smiled softly. "Then we fail together." The honesty in his tone left her breathless. She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I'll do it." For a moment, they simply stood there, two silhouettes beneath an umbrella, framed by the glow of passing headlights. The world didn't pause, but for them, it might as well have. Back at her apartment later that night, Mia stood by the window, watching the storm drift east. She thought about how far she'd come from serving coffee to saving contracts, from being invisible to being seen. She thought about Ethan, the man who had once shouted, "You're fired!" across a room, and how that same man had just offered her a future. And yet, beneath the gratitude, she felt something deeper stirring a quiet ache she didn't dare name. It wasn't about love, not exactly. It was about recognition. About two souls who had been running from loneliness in opposite directions, finally stopping long enough to see each other. At Pierce Holdings, change came fast. Mia's promotion became official within weeks. Her new title, Director of Global Communications, sparked both admiration and envy, but no one dared question her competence. She proved herself again and again, translating not just languages but egos, emotions, and cultures. Ethan, meanwhile, seemed lighter. He smiled more. He listened more. And when their eyes met across a conference table, there was a warmth there neither could hide anymore. One evening, after a long presentation, the last of the staff trickled out. Ethan lingered at the doorway. "You know," he said, "every time I think I've learned everything there is to know about people, you walk in and prove me wrong." Mia laughed, turning off the projector. "And here I thought you hated surprises." "Not anymore," he said, "at least not yours." He stepped closer, stopping just short of reaching for her hand. The space between them thrummed with quiet electricity, the kind that says not yet, but soon. As she gathered her things, she glanced at him, her voice soft. "Ethan?" "Yes?" "Don't forget what you told me. Once control isn't peace." He smiled, the words landing somewhere deep. "And trust builds it," he finished. When the lights went out and the city stretched beyond the glass, they stood in the reflection of their own story, once divided by power and circumstance, now united by truth. Neither of them knew where it would lead, but for the first time, neither of them was afraid to find out. The weeks that followed blurred into a whirlwind of travel, press releases, and long hours that stitched day into night. Under Mia's new leadership, the Global Communications Division became the company's heartbeat. She was on every call, every meeting, every crisis, guiding chaos into coherence. But success had a strange way of feeling heavy. There were moments, alone in her office at midnight, when she'd glance at the skyline and realize how quiet it was without Ethan. He still came to meetings, still shared jokes, but there was a cautious distance now, something unspoken that neither seemed ready to name. One Friday evening, as the office emptied, she found him pacing by the window, phone in hand, voice low but sharp. "No, I said finalize the bid before closing. We can't afford delays. Yes, call me when it's done." He ended the call and rubbed the back of his neck. "You're still working?" she asked softly. He looked up, half smiling. "I could ask you the same thing." "Fair point." She set her files down. "You look exhausted." "So do you," he countered. "Though somehow exhaustion looks good on you." She rolled her eyes, laughing. Flattery doesn't make deadlines disappear. He studied her for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "You ever stop and think about what happened? How we got here?" Mia hesitated. "Every day. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still the same person who walked into that boardroom with a tray of coffee." "You're not," he said. "And that's a good thing." She tilted her head. "Are you?" His answer came slower. "I'm trying to be. But it's strange, after everything, I don't know who I am without the fight." They fell silent, the city humming below like a restless heartbeat. Then Ethan turned, his eyes searching hers. "You taught me something I didn't expect, Mia." "What's that?" "That honesty can be power, too. Maybe the only kind that lasts." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled somewhere between gratitude and fear. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed again. He frowned at the screen. "It's Vale," he muttered. "Apparently, he's still not done causing trouble." "What now?" "He's pitching a merger to the board behind my back. If he gets the votes, he'll dilute my shares and take control." Mia's heart sank. "Can he do that?" "He can try, but not if the investors stand with me, and they will if they understand what this company really is." He looked at her, his expression steady but tired. "That's where you come in." "Me?" "You're the voice they trust. They'll believe you before they believe me. I need you to speak at the investor summit next week. Tell them what Pierce Holdings stands for now." Mia blinked. "Ethan, I translate languages, not politics." "You translate people," he said. "That's harder." The request sat between them, heavy with responsibility. She knew what he was asking more than a speech. It was faith. It was trust. "All right," she said finally. "I'll do it." The days leading up to the summit passed in a blur of preparation. Mia drafted speeches, revised phrasing, rehearsed in front of mirrors, until the words no longer felt like words, but conviction. Yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, doubt crept in. What if she failed him this time? On the morning of the event, the conference hall gleamed with precision rows of polished seats, screens flashing the company logo, the low murmur of investors gathering like a tide. Cameras waited. The stakes were brutal. Ethan greeted her backstage, dressed in a dark suit that somehow looked heavier than usual. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." He smiled faintly. "That's exactly why you'll be perfect." When she stepped onto the stage, the lights nearly blinded her. Hundreds of eyes turned her way. The teleprompter waited, but she didn't look at it. She looked at Ethan instead, standing near the side of the stage, hands clasped behind his back. And she began to speak. "At its core," she said, her voice steady, "this company was never about profit. It was about purpose. It was built by people who believed in solving problems across borders, across languages, and building trust where misunderstanding used to live." She paused, scanning the crowd. "I started here as a waitress at a corporate event. I didn't belong in that room. But when I spoke up, when I told the truth, someone listened. And that moment changed everything." The murmurs stilled. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. "This company stands for that," she continued. "For listening, for second chances, for integrity that doesn't depend on how much power you hold, but how you use it." She caught Ethan's eyes again. He looked proud, prouder than she'd ever seen him. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Investors stood, cameras flashed. It was more than approval, it was belief. Afterward, reporters swarmed. Investors congratulated her, but Mia barely heard them. All she could think of was the quiet moment afterward, when Ethan found her backstage. "You did it?" he said softly. "We did it," she corrected. He smiled. "You realize you just saved this company for the second time?" "Third," she teased. "You forget Tokyo." He laughed, the sound rich with relief. "Remind me never to underestimate you again." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them pulsed with the same current that had always been there. Only now it felt inevitable. He reached out as if to shake her hand, but their fingers lingered. His touch was warm, grounding. "Mia," he said quietly, "I meant what I said months ago. You've changed everything." Her heart thudded. "So have you." He hesitated, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Then maybe we stop pretending this is just business." She met his gaze, unsure whether to laugh or run. "That sounds complicated." "Everything worth doing is," he said. Before she could answer, the door burst open, an assistant rushing in with a stack of folders and urgent news. The spell broke. Ethan stepped back, professionalism snapping into place. But his eyes lingered on her just a second too long. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Mia watched the broadcast replay. There she was, speaking on stage, confident, composed, a woman who had found her voice. But it wasn't the speech that made her chest ache. It was the look Ethan had given her, the one that said something had shifted between them again. The city outside glimmered, endless and alive. For the first time, she didn't feel small beneath it. She felt like part of its pulse. Whatever happened next, whether it was love, friendship, or something far more complicated, she knew one thing for certain: she would never stand silent again. Because truth, once spoken, never really goes quiet. It just waits to be heard again. The morning after the summit felt different. The air itself seemed lighter, as if the city had exhaled. Every major paper ran the same headline: "Waitress turned executive saves Pierce Holdings with one speech." Reporters camped outside the building, eager for quotes, but Mia kept her head down. She didn't crave attention. The real victory wasn't fame, it was peace. For once, the company wasn't drowning in scandal. Inside the glass tower, employees moved with a new kind of energy. People greeted her in the halls now, some with respect, some with awe, others with quiet gratitude. They'd seen what she stood for and, more importantly, who she stood beside. Ethan's office door was open when she arrived. He was reading an article on his tablet, smirking slightly. "You've officially stolen my spotlight," he said without looking up. Mia dropped a folder on his desk. "Maybe the world just prefers honesty to money." "Then we're both in trouble," he said, finally glancing up. His eyes were tired, but his smile was softer than she'd ever seen it. "Come in. Close the door." She did. "I spoke with the board this morning," he said. "They're reinstating full authority under my leadership, and they want to expand your department into its own division, cross-cultural strategy. You'll report directly to me." Mia blinked. "You mean a promotion?" "I mean a partnership," he said. "I don't want another executive who nods and agrees. I want someone who'll tell me the truth, even when it hurts." She laughed softly. "Careful what you wish for." "I already got it," he replied. The room went quiet for a beat too long. The weight of unspoken things hung between them like static. He looked down, fidgeting with his pen, a rare show of nerves for a man who'd once terrified Wall Street. "You did something at that summit I couldn't," he said. "You made them believe again. Not just in the company and me. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to," she said. "You earned it." But Ethan shook his head. "No, Mia. You gave me something I didn't know I'd lost." Her chest tightened. "What's that?" "Faith." For a moment, neither spoke. The city glowed behind him, sunlight splintering through the glass and catching in the silver strands of his hair. He looked older and younger at once, a man rebuilt. Finally, Mia stood. "Then keep it. Just promise You'll use it well." He nodded, voice rough. "Always." She left before the silence could turn into something else. In the weeks that followed, her new role took shape. She led global teams, built new partnerships, and traveled across continents. Every meeting carried a new challenge, every flight a chance to see the world she'd once only dreamed of. Yet no matter how far she went, Tokyo, Paris, London, her phone would light up with a short message every few days. Ethan, still listening. Mia, still speaking truth. It became their quiet ritual, a tether between worlds. One afternoon in Paris for a new negotiation, she found herself walking through the Latin Quarter, the same street she'd nearly studied in years ago. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of rain and espresso. She stopped outside a bookstore, where students laughed under faded awnings, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of survival pressing on her chest. Her phone buzzed again. "Ethan, conference went well. Proud of you." She smiled. "You're learning to compliment people, Mr. Caldwell. Only you. Everyone else still gets numbers." That made her laugh out loud. But beneath the humor, something tender stirred. She typed before she could overthink it. "Come to Paris. You need a break." There was a pause. Then, "Tomorrow." When Ethan arrived the next afternoon, jet-lagged but smiling, he looked out of place among the narrow streets and old stone buildings. "I forgot cities could be quiet," he said, standing beside her on the Pont Neuf. "Quiet's good for people who think too much," she teased. "I prefer to call it strategic reflection." "Right," she said. "And how's that working out for you?" He grinned. "Better now." "Oh." They walked for hours, talking about everything and nothing. The absurd bureaucracy of French business, the best croissants in the city, the little bookstore she loved. At sunset, they stopped near the Seine, the golden light catching in the water. Ethan leaned against the railing, looking at her. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent half my life thinking success meant standing alone. But every time I look at you, I realize I was wrong." Mia turned toward him, her heartbeat uneven. "What does it mean now?" He exhaled, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "It means finding someone who keeps you honest, someone who reminds you why you started." Her chest tightened. "Careful, Ethan. That sounds dangerously close to sincerity." He laughed, the sound low and real. "Don't tell the board." They stood there in silence, watching the city glow against the darkening sky. Then, gently, he reached for her hand. His touch was light, uncertain, as if asking permission. She didn't pull away. "Mia," he said quietly, "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt people. But if you'll let me, I'd like to build something different this time. Not a company, a life." She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the soft shimmer of the river. "Ethan, you don't need to build another empire." "I'm not trying to," he said. "I just don't want to build it alone." Her heart stuttered. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The city's hum faded, replaced by the rhythm of their breathing. Then she smiled, slow and certain. "Then stop talking about blueprints," she said, "and start listening." He laughed, stepping closer until their foreheads nearly touched. Always, when he kissed her, it wasn't cinematic or grand. It was quiet, human, two people who had weathered storms finding peace in the simplest connection. The world didn't pause, but for once, neither of them cared. Back at her hotel later that night, Mia stood by the window, watching Paris shimmer under a light drizzle. The city had always been a symbol of what she'd lost. Dreams postponed, chances deferred. Now it was something else entirely. Proof that life could bend, change, heal. Her phone buzzed again. "Ethan." Still listening. She smiled, typing back. "Mia." "Then keep listening. The story's just beginning." Outside, the rain eased. The lights along the Seine flickered like promises kept. And somewhere between the heartbeat of the city and the echo of that kiss, Mia Carter finally understood what redemption really meant. Not rewriting the past, but speaking the truth until the future finally hears it. Autumn swept across New York like a long sigh leaf spinning down from the high-rise planters, the air turning sharp with the scent of rain and roasted chestnuts. When Mia returned from Paris, the city felt new, yet familiar, as though she'd left a piece of herself behind on that bridge over the Seine. The story between her and Ethan had shifted quietly, naturally, into something neither of them dared label. It lived in glances, in late-night messages, in the way silence between them had become comfortable instead of cold. But peace never lingered long in Ethan's world. Within weeks, the company faced another storm, one born not of scandal, but of ambition. A new opportunity had appeared. A massive merger with an energy conglomerate that could either elevate Pierce Holdings to a global powerhouse or destroy its independence entirely. The board was divided. Investors buzzed with excitement, and every journalist in the city waited to see whether the company that had just redeemed itself would now sell its soul. Ethan's office became a war room. Charts, reports, and proposals covered every surface. Mia, as head of global communications, was drawn into every meeting, every draft of every statement. Her job wasn't just translation now. It was protection, of truth, of tone, of reputation. One night, long after the others had left, she found him standing by the window again, the skyline mirrored in the glass like a ghost. "You're doing it again," she said gently. He turned, brow furrowed. "Doing what? Carrying everything by yourself?" He gave a humorless smile. "That's what CEOs do. That's what you used to do," she corrected. "Before you learned that listening doesn't make you weak." He studied her, the corners of his mouth twitching in reluctant amusement. "You never let me forget my lessons, do you?" "Someone has to," she said softly. He exhaled, his tone lowering. "If we agree to this merger, Pierce Holdings won't be mine anymore. It'll belong to the board. To shareholders who don't care about integrity, just returns. But if I don't sign, we risk falling behind for years." Mia walked closer, folding her arms. "Then what do you want?" "I want to build something that lasts," he said. "Something honest. But I don't know if that's possible anymore." "It is," she said, her voice firm. "You just have to decide who you're building it for." The words hung there, heavy and true. For a moment, the city outside flickered like a heartbeat reflected in glass. A week later, the merger talks began in earnest. The visiting delegation arrived, sleek suits, sharper smiles. Their lead negotiator, a woman named Serena Holt, was everything Ethan used to be. Polished, brilliant, dangerous. Her tone dripped confidence as she laid out terms that glittered with profit but hid quiet traps in every clause. As she spoke, Mia's stomach tightened. She recognized the rhythm of manipulation, the charm that dressed deceit in reason. She glanced at Ethan, saw the same realization cross his face, and knew he understood the risk. When the presentation ended, Serena smiled. "This is the future, Mr. Caldwell. Together we can make history." Ethan nodded politely. "Or become it." Her smile thinned. "That's the cost of hesitation." He leaned forward. "No, that's the cost of forgetting why we started." Serena's gaze flicked to Mia, lingering just long enough to sting. "Impressive speech," she said smoothly. "You've trained your interpreter well." Mia's expression didn't waver. "I don't translate for him anymore," she said calmly. "I speak with him." The subtle shift in power was immediate. Ethan didn't have to say another word. Serena gathered her papers with a faint frown. "We'll revisit the offer," she said, her tone suddenly neutral. When the door closed behind her, Ethan turned to Mia, shaking his head in disbelief. "You didn't even raise your voice." "Didn't need to," she said. "Some people only hear authority when it whispers." He chuckled softly. "Remind me to never get on your bad side." "You already did," she teased. Months ago. The next morning, the board convened for a final vote. The tension was thick, the air brittle. Robert Vale, resurfaced and still bitter, had managed to sway several members to support the merger. The outcome teetered on a knife's edge. As discussions dragged on, Ethan rose from his chair. "Before you vote," he said, "there's something you should hear." He gestured toward Mia. "She's the reason we're still standing, and she deserves to speak." The murmurs quieted. Mia hesitated, then stepped forward. "I've worked in rooms like this before," she began. Rooms where the people with power forgot that their decisions ripple far beyond numbers. Where success became a language only a few could speak. But I've also seen what happens when someone listens instead of dictates, when integrity becomes the currency. Her eyes swept the table. You all know what Pierce Holdings was. You know what it is now. The choice in front of you isn't about profit, it's about whether you still believe in what you rebuilt. The room was silent. Every face turned inward, thoughtful. When the vote finally came, it was close but not close enough. The merger failed. Ethan's shoulders lowered as the final tally was read. Relief and pride warred in his expression. "You just saved us again," he murmured. "No," she said. "You saved yourself by choosing right this time." He smiled faintly. "You really don't like giving me credit, do you? I give it where it's due." He laughed quietly. "Then I'll take that as a compliment." As the room emptied, the sun broke through the clouds, light flooding across the polished table. For once, the air felt still, unburdened. Ethan walked to the window, his reflection merging with the city beyond. "You know, Mia," he said, voice thoughtful, "when I fired that translator months ago, I thought I was protecting perfection. Turns out I was just afraid of being wrong." She smiled. "And now?" "Now I'm afraid of losing the people who made me better." Her heart caught at the words. "Then don't." He turned to her, eyes steady. "I don't plan to." The moment was simple, quiet, and it felt like everything. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the city streets. Inside, two people who had once lived in different worlds stood side by side, equal at last. Neither knew what the future held, but they understood this. Redemption wasn't a single act or speech or deal. It was a series of choices, small, stubborn, human. And in that golden light, surrounded by the city that had once tested them both, Ethan Caldwell and Mia Carter finally realized they were no longer speaking different languages. They were building the same story. Winter arrived with a kind of quiet clarity, the kind that strips a city down to its bones. The lights along Fifth Avenue shimmered against the frost, and the night stretched longer, softer, slower. Inside Pierce Holdings, the rhythm had changed too. The chaos of deals and politics had cooled into something steadier, almost graceful. Mia had built her division into a model of transparency. Every negotiation passed through her desk. Every cross-border project began with a conversation, not a command. The building felt lighter, people more grounded. Yet, amid all that calm, something inside her was restless. It wasn't dissatisfaction, it was wonder. How had a shy waitress become the moral compass of a billion-dollar empire? And why, even now, did her heart still race every time Ethan Caldwell walked into the room? He had changed, too. The edge that once defined him had softened. He still carried authority, but it no longer felt like a weapon. It was steadier, kinder. He thanked people by name, asked about their families, laughed in hallways. His presence no longer dominated, it anchored. And though he and Mia had grown close, they both seemed to dance around the invisible line neither dared to cross too soon. One evening, just before Christmas, Ethan invited her to the company's winter gala. "You can't skip it this time," he said, leaning in her doorway with that half-smile that still made her pulse flicker. "It's mandatory fun." "Those two words don't belong together," she said, looking up from her laptop. "They do when I say them." She rolled her eyes. "Fine, but only because you'll need someone to keep you from scaring donors with your business face." He grinned. "Deal." The gala was held in a ballroom that glittered like a frozen dream crystal chandeliers, silver garlands, a live jazz band playing under the soft hum of conversation. Mia arrived in a midnight blue dress that caught the light like the ocean. When Ethan saw her, he forgot for a moment how to speak. "You clean up well, Mr. Caldwell," she teased, breaking his stare. "So do you," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Shall we?" They moved through the room together, laughter trailing in their wake. People watched, curious, intrigued, but neither seemed to notice. It was as if the rest of the world had faded, leaving only the rhythm of their steps and the warmth of their shared glance. Halfway through the evening, The band shifted into something slower. Ethan turned to her, his voice soft. "Dance with me." "Oh, Ethan, I don't." "Don't worry," he said, extending a hand. "I'll lead." She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The touch was steady, familiar. As they moved to the music, her head just below his chin, she could feel his heart beating a calm, sure rhythm against the noise of everything else. "You know," he murmured, "every time I think I've reached the top, something reminds me that I didn't climb it alone." Mia smiled faintly. "You didn't, but you listened your way up this time. House? That's your lesson, not mine. It's ours," she said quietly. He looked down at her then, eyes dark with thought. "You make me want to be better, Mia. Not richer, not bigger, just better." Her breath caught. For a moment the world outside the dance floor blurred. The chandeliers became stars, the music a heartbeat. "Then you already are," she whispered. When the song ended, neither of them moved right away. Applause rippled softly around them, but they stayed in that stillness, caught between what was and what might be. Then Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that carried relief, admiration, and something deeper, something that didn't need words. Later that night, as guests filtered out, snow began to fall beyond the tall glass windows. The city glowed white and gold, soft and unreal. Ethan and Mia stepped outside together, the sound of laughter fading behind them. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked, pulling her coat tight. "When you fired your translator and nearly ruined everything?" He chuckled, breath clouding in the cold. "Every day, though I remember it more fondly now that it led to you." She laughed softly. "You make it sound like fate." "Maybe it was," he said. "Or maybe it was just a woman who refused to stay silent." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, snow crunching beneath their steps. Then Ethan stopped. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." Mia turned to him, brow furrowed. "What is it?" He hesitated, searching for words. "When all this started, I thought you were a lesson. A reminder to be humble, to listen. But you're more than that. You're the reason I remember who I am when the rest of the world tries to make me forget." Her breath caught. "Ethan," he shook his head, smiling softly, "I don't expect anything from you, I just needed to say it. Because if there's one thing you've taught me, it's that silence costs more than honesty." The snow fell harder, soft flakes catching in her hair. She wanted to answer, to tell him that he had changed her too, that he'd given her a faith she didn't know she'd lost. But before she could speak, a gust of wind carried a laugh from nearby, one of the staff slipping on the steps, the moment broken into something ordinary again. Ethan chuckled, offering his arm. "Come on. Let's get you home before we both freeze." They walked to his car, the city gleaming around them like a promise. As he drove her through quiet streets, she looked out the window, watching snow gather on street lamps and rooftops. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked softly. "The power, the pressure, the spotlight?" He thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But then I remember the view from the top isn't worth much if you can't share it with someone who sees the world from the ground." "Oh," she smiled, turning toward him. "You really have learned to talk like a poet." He grinned. "I've been taking lessons." When they reached her building, the snow had deepened, blanketing the world in silver quiet. She lingered by the door, reluctant to leave. "Good night, Ethan," she said finally. He nodded. "Good night, Mia." But neither moved. The air between them felt charged again, as if the universe were holding its breath. Then, slowly, she rose on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "For listening," she whispered. He looked at her, eyes shining with something unspoken. "Always," she smiled, stepping back into the snow. Then, "Don't stop." As he drove away, she watched the taillights fade into the white blur of the storm, her heart steady and full. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Because this wasn't just a story about a billionaire or a waitress, about power or redemption. It was a story about what happens when two people stop chasing perfection and start chasing truth. And somewhere in that frozen night, beneath the endless hum of the city that had tested and changed them both, Mia Carter finally understood. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles begin with the simplest words, "You're fired." "Aye?" Winter gave way to spring quietly, as if the city itself was catching its breath after the long frost. The streets of Manhattan bloomed with color again, yellow cabs and pink tulips, steam rising from manholes like ghosts leaving the past. For Mia, the season brought something deeper, a sense of beginning that didn't feel borrowed or temporary. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from anything. She was moving towards something that felt like hers. Pierce Holdings was thriving. The company's reputation had transformed from a cautionary tale into a case study of ethical leadership. Investors praised its human-first strategy. Employees started calling it the company that listens. And in quiet moments when she walked the glass hallways, Mia still couldn't quite believe that she had helped rebuild it from a trembling act of courage in one meeting to a movement that changed its culture. But the more success they tasted, the more complicated her relationship with Ethan became. They were closer than ever connected by the rhythm of long workdays, private jokes, and shared silences that said more than words. Yet, beneath the calm, something unspoken rippled. The knowledge that affection, when mixed with power, was dangerous ground. One late evening, as the last lights dimmed in the tower, Ethan appeared in her doorway. He didn't knock anymore. He just leaned against the frame, his tie loose, sleeves rolled up, the look of a man who'd been fighting the world all day and somehow still managed to look calm. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." "I own the building," he said dryly. "What's your excuse?" "Trying to finish the report before tomorrow's audit." He crossed the room, setting down a cup of coffee beside her. "That's my job, not yours." She looked up, eyes tired but amused. "And yet, here we are again." "Oh." For a moment, neither moved. The hum of the city was a soft percussion beyond the glass. Then Ethan said quietly, "I've been thinking about stepping down." Mia froze. "What?" He nodded slowly. "I've done what I came here to do. The company doesn't need a symbol anymore. It needs a system that can survive without me." Her heart kicked. "Ethan, you built this. You can't just walk away." "I can," he said gently, "because now there's someone who can carry it forward." "Oh," she shook her head, not understanding. "You don't mean," he smiled faintly. "You already